Cal Ripken, can show up for work 2,132 straight days, and I couldn't make it here more than 2 out of the last 5 Saturdays. You didn't know I wasn't here for 3 of the last 5 Saturdays? Okay, fine, we'll forget that.
I missed you.
You missed me? Having said that, back to the ballot campaigns. Barbara Anderson from Citizens for Limited Taxation, Gene Hartigan, Republican consultant. I want to spend one more minute on the death penalty thing we talked about a minute ago. We said that you were the consultant, you're the chief campaign advisor for Janice Berry, a Republican who ran against Scott Harshbarger. Janice Berry supported the death penalty, Harshbarger against the death penalty. Did you ever sit back and say, I've got a great idea at the beginning of this campaign. If the voters allegedly support the death penalty in Massachusetts, why not collect signatures? Why not put it on the ballot and let those 2 parallel campaigns, a la sort of Pete Wilson and Prop 187, the anti-immigrant proposition in California. Did you ever think about that? Is that a decent strategy for candidates?
Well, when Janice ran against Scott in the last election, she got a high profile because of the death penalty, and a number of death penalty supporters or people who were relatives of victims did support her. The problem
But would it have been more central an issue if this question had been on the ballot?
Well, it's, as Barbara can tell you, it's very tough to pull people together to go out and do a ballot question petition drive and to stay with it and push that question. And everyone thought, all the polling data told us that if Scott Harshbarger was associated with being opposed to it, it would damage him greatly. The problem was getting the message out, and the press wasn't listening last time.
Speaking of organization, let's just shift gears to one more question that apparently isn't going to be on the ballot. Scott Harshbarger did certify a question that would significantly cut back on affirmative action in Massachusetts. It had the support of a lot of high-profile people. Jeff Jacoby of the Globe, who sits here on Sunday nights, Avi Nelson, conservative commentator, and others. They announced very recently they weren't going to go ahead with this despite the certification from the Harshbarger, saying basically it's a lack of organization, it's too late, we'll look at it again in '98. Is it really a lack of organization in that case, or is Massachusetts a state where there's a lack of passion for something so racially and politically
No, absolutely
divisive?
not. There's plenty of passion for this issue. The problem is, yeah, you know, Jim, yourself, every couple of years about 10, 20, 15 people file petitions, and only 5 or 6 or 7 or sometimes 9 make it to the ballot. People often don't realize when they file for the first time what a tremendous undertaking it is to do a ballot campaign. And so they file their petition, they plan that, they spend all their time drafting it, and then they get up against the petition drive and realize they just don't have the organization. I am sure the affirmative action group will, in 2 years, have put together...
The anti-affirmative action group.
Right, the group that's doing the affirmative action, anti-affirmative action petition will have put together its organization in the next 2 years if something isn't done on that issue nationally or statewide.
I know, believe me, I know from personal experience you say how hard it is to collect signatures, but doesn't it strain credibility a little bit that people as politically sophisticated, whether one agrees with them or not in my case, as the Avi Nelsons, the Jeff Jacoby, went into this thing and then all of a sudden said, oh my God, Harshbarger certified it, we didn't know what we were doing?
Politically sophisticated has nothing to do with understanding how ballot questions work. Unless you have been through a ballot question, you said it about yourself, that unless you've been through it, unless you have actually gone through the stress of trying to get 65,000 signatures in 8 weeks, you have no idea what you're up against until finally you're looking at that petition and realize you don't have 10,000 petitioners to go out there and get your signatures for you.
Let's talk about the ones that are more likely to be there for a couple of minutes. Barbara, you want to describe in 30 seconds what is being described as this pay raise repeal question that you and Chip Ford are basically the primary moving forces behind?
Yeah, our coalition, which is also made up of Limits, Citizens for Limited Taxation, and United We Stand America, we're going to put together a question on the ballot, if we get the signatures, that will cut the legislative session in half. So we're going to let them keep their $46,000 that they put in a couple of days last winter, in an outrageous 55% pay increase, but we're going to only have them working and getting paid for 6 months. So in the end, they're making $23,000. That turns them effectively into a citizen legislature that goes out and lives in the real world with the laws it's creating, and also puts an end, we hope, to the lame duck sessions during which they pass themselves pay raises or repeal the capital gains tax or pass tax increases or do other things in the middle of the night or during the holiday season when they don't even know what they're doing, and we certainly don't know what they're doing. If
they get the 64,000 signatures, Gene, do you think this one might be a winner?
I think they are. I think people just want reform, and if they can look at it on the ballot and vote for it, I think they'll support it.
It's 2 times in the past pay raises have been repealed, correct?
Yeah, normally what we've done in the past is simply we've repealed the pay raise directly. If they gave themselves a 25% or 30% pay raise, we put it in the ballot, and it would be repealed back to where it was. This time we could not do a repeal referendum because of the shenanigans of the legislature attaching it to something that you explained earlier in the program that you're not allowed to do a referendum on. So this time we had to wait to the initiative petition process. Now we could create our own pay level and do all kinds of other things within this petition. So we have the 6-month session. We're having an audit of the legislature built into it by the Attorney General or by the Inspector General and the State Auditor. And we're going to let them raise their own pay each year the same way that median family income goes up or down. Cost of living, right.
Who do you expect to oppose this thing? I moved to Massachusetts in the mid-1980s, and I remember during the 1986 pay raise repeal campaign, as I was listening to the radio, driving around the state, there was one lone soul, Jack Flood, former state legislator, who was the only person I ever heard speaking out against this thing. Is there going to be any organized constituency that either of you can see who are actually going to stand up to voters and say, I want to speak out in favor of this level of salary, in favor of a 12-month session? Do you think that's...
All those brave legislators who voted for their own pay raise of 55% after the election last time when they were safely reelected, I'm sure they're all going to stand up and tell their constituents how much they're worth it.
I should say to you, in a couple of minutes, we're going to be joined by Diane Wilkerson, who's a state senator in Massachusetts. Get to see what some people inside feel about this issue and a couple of other parallel ones. Let's continue to move through some of these questions since there are a lot of them. On the last campaign trail in 1994, rent control was repealed. It only existed in 3 communities, but basically the question said no community, including Boston, Brookline, and Cambridge, which had it, may establish it even if they locally want to. There's a question on the ballot that does a little bit more, but also reestablishes the right of local communities to implement rent control. Some people are arguing that even though it technically is proper to be back on the ballot so quickly, that really isn't playing fair. I, as a pro-rent control person, even have some concerns about this. What do you think, Gene?
I think the rent control measure will go down to defeat. I think people have spent many, many years trying to get rent control under control so that people who are landlords, who are owners of property, who are getting hit 6 ways to Sunday legally and personally will say no. And I think there are more people who will support keeping it out where it is now than support putting it back into practice.
Well, some like me would say what I said before. If it weren't for a 6-to-1 spending differential, that 2-point margin in 1994 might have gone the other way. But I was speaking, Barbara, but I was speaking to the issue of what do you think about a question like this being right back before the voters, even though it's in a different incarnation than it was before?
Well, you were talking earlier about the things you're not allowed to do with initiative petitions, and one of the things you're not allowed to do is something that has essentially been done in the last 4 years. So they couldn't come back in and reinstate rent control. But I think that's a very, very narrow point, which is you're not allowed to do exactly the same thing with maybe a minor change.
Which they perfectly legally have changed in defense of the people putting this thing forward. It's called the Community Empowerment Act, I should say.
I think it's iffy. I think it's basically they're trying to repeal what the voters just passed, but I can see where it was enough of a gray area that Harshbarger might certify it. I think this time, if there's a real debate on rent control and you actually have things written on the ballot so people know exactly what it is they're voting on when they go into the voting booth, I think rent control is going down really big this time.
Let's touch on a couple of more. How do you feel about not being involved in a ballot question that proposes to cut the sales tax from 5% to 3%, $1 billion cut in taxes, and Barbara Anderson has nothing to do with it?
Well, I've never seen a tax cut I didn't like. It would if I weren't so excited about the Coalition for Pay Raise repeal. And what we're trying to do is change the structure of the entire universe out there that passes these tax increases. The auto excise tax was another temporary tax during World War II to discourage people from driving so they could send rubber to the tanks in Europe. It shouldn't still be on the books, and I think if somebody can get the signatures and repeal it, that's fine with me.
There are 3 or 4 tax cut questions on this ballot. We're 3 or 4 weeks away from the first of 7 years of deep, fairly deep, cuts in federal assistance to the state, federal benefits to individuals. Do you think that tax cutting in this environment, when people are going to start to see health benefits, federal fuel assistance for poor people in cold regions of the country start to disappear, really has a shot, as attractive as tax cuts tend to be in Massachusetts?
I think they are, and I think people will vote to repeal them. The problem with government today is it is...
Even though they didn't in 1990.
Well, but I think it's a different time. I think people always look at their pocketbook and they take a deep breath and say, my goodness, more of my money's going back out. And it goes out to our state in great amounts. And I think people have said, enough is enough. Let us cut back some of it. Let's live within our means, because we as individuals have to live within our means. And they are sending a very clear message to government, it is time you live within your means, and we can make it happen. We can still take care of those who are in need, and we have to build those safety nets, and I think those have to be there to help people.
They're going to lose, but they should hire you in that campaign. Let me just say that right here. Having said that, we've got to take a break. When we come back in a couple of minutes, we'll be joined by Diane Wilkerson, state senator from Boston, talk a few more minutes about ballot questions, and at the same time, we'll celebrate 15 months being the only OJ-free talk show in America. Come back right more to it. Back in that endless list were the questions that were certified by Scott Harshbarger, Attorney General of Massachusetts, to be on the 96th ballot if people get those 64,000 signatures. We're back with Barbara Anderson from Citizens for Limited Taxation, Jean Hartigan, a Republican consultant, and we're joined by State Senator Diane Wilkerson. Thanks for being with us.
Pleasure.
Diane, I'm going to revisit a couple things we talked about earlier because I think we should get a different perspective of somebody who actually serves on Beacon Hill. The consensus, and I'm embarrassed to say I agreed with these two people, even though we agree on virtually nothing else, is that the growing number and passion of ballot questions, not in Massachusetts but across the country in the 26 states that allow them, is a function of people on the left or right dissatisfaction with what's happening or not happening in their state houses. As somebody who actually talks to their constituents and serves on Beacon Hill, do you get the same sense?
I think that the short answer to that is yes, but I have some grave concerns about the way and the frequency with which the referendum process.
What are
is
those
being
concerns?
used. I think that part of it is a result of a more educated electorate, but it's only one. It tends to be one part of that.
That's
electorate.
the problem, or that's...
Well, that it tends to, in my mind, very one-sided.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's no doubt that there's major dissatisfaction and frustration, but I also think people just know more about the process now than they did before. The problem, I think, tends to be with the kind of issues that we're seeing. My fear is that there are some things that simply shouldn't be put to a majority vote, if you will.
You mean even if they're constitutionally permissible to be put there?
Yes.
Give me an example of what the concern
I mean,
is.
I have no doubt, and people have laughed, you know, when I said this, but one of the analogies that I have would have been slavery. And I'm questioning even what would happen if we put it to a referendum in 1995.
Which technically, but technically under the Constitution of Massachusetts, by the way, it could be before the voters in this state.
And certainly the whole issue of the Supreme Court's actions around the desegregation of public schools, for example, was something that they finally had to do because there was not support from the
Nor
public
should there have been.
to do that, or integration.
But Senator, the slavery, the legislators in these states supported slavery. A majority of the legislators in all these states. Fine, wipe out the ballot question, but wipe out the legislators
I
too.
agree. No, I'm not
The
disputing
Constitution
that.
protects us from
I'm
these
not
things.
disputing
Senator.
that. My only point is that part of the process that we have, not only in our court system, but also to some extent the legislature, was to protect and at least be able to debate and consider the minority interest. I do think that gets lost in the referendum process. But I'm not advocating that we do away with it. You asked me a question about what my concerns are, and it is a concern.
Within the constitutional whatever that we have here, how do you deal with concerns like those that you have? I mean, as I say before you came on the show, I was concerned when I was hired 7 years ago for my job that there were too many tax cut questions on the ballot, and they're so seductive that it's easy to pass, and from my perspective at least, well, in 1 year at least we took care of that. But having said that, so what do you do, any of you, what do you do if you do have concerns? I know you don't. What do you do if you do have concerns, if people out there have concerns about the breadth of issues that are before the voters that arguably could be considered at least more deliberatively by 200 men and women in a state house?
Please, that deliberation, Senator, I'm not doing this to put you on the spot, but how many hours after you voted to cut the capital gains tax did you find out that you'd voted to cut the capital gains tax?
I actually heard it on the news.
Yeah, so there's my...
That was part of the pay raise thing, though.
We did
talk about
show.
delivering.
That's all we actually did,
We
that's
did
right.
a show shortly after that, and I was very clear about my frustration.
That's right.
It's not the first time
But
that
if the
it has
voters
happened.
voted to repeal the capital gains tax, it would have been on the ballot visibly for everybody to see before they voted.
But also, if we had done it in the way that it was supposed to be done, we would have gotten to do that too. And I think that one of the things that's happening is in the legislature. No doubt in my mind that the process took a beating about the public reaction to what happened around capital gains tax and the legislative pay raise.
For those who don't know, by the way, on virtually
changed.
the same day the same day that the pay raise was approved and signed by Bill Weld, who said he would never sign a pay raise, a capital gains cut found its way to Bill Weld's desk, which apparently 197 of the 200 men and women, I'm not being facetious, in the State House had no idea it was being passed. It was called a tax cut for low-income individuals.
No doubt that there was connection and that there was a deal.
But
there's no doubt in my mind that there was, and I think there was. I personally was kind of offended that people would argue that it just happened to be the same day, and that if you just read it, you would have known, because that's not the way the process was working. But I think.
Let me give the flip side of your concern, which I think is a serious one. How about the notion that real people, if they can go out in a grassroots fashion with a decent organization, they clearly need an organization, can get questions that they care about deeply debated. Well, everybody wants to win. I like winning a lot more than losing. Having a broad public debate amongst real people, citizens, is a pretty important thing to getting to your ultimate goals. Isn't that an important thing that's a consequence of
but I don't think
questions?
that's the way our referendum process
You don't?
is working.
Why?
I think it's another process where people with money get a chance to promote.
Well, there are now two of us who
debate.
believe that.
Sure, there. You know, that's just another process where people with money, more money than the people who don't have it, get
That's
to
not
have.
true. Again, you
distribute
guys always had more money than we did, and we always won until recently, and then that year you had more money than we did, too. It doesn't mean anything.
How about I have another proposal, by the way, which I
Means
haven't
a
thought
lot.
of just now. How about a reform proposal that might satisfy everybody here? What if it turned out that before any question were to go to the voters, and this is not in the Constitution in Massachusetts right now, and probably not in most people's Constitution, that the question has to be before the legislature for at least a year, that you have to give representative democracy a chance. Legislators know, just let me finish the thought, that if they choose to ignore or give short shrift to an important issue or an unimportant issue, Jane Doe or John Doe or Barbara Anderson
It
or
is before
Diane
the
Wilkerson.
legislature. Anything we filed right now is
But for a
before the
very short time
legislature.
period as an
They
initiative.
know it is not going to.
You were shaking your head. What do you think?
Most issues go
More than a
before the
year.
legislature, and it's that, for that reason alone that people then take to the streets out of anger and distrust. And remember, the referendum process is played out in almost every community in the state every year in what they call town meeting. It's something where people gather together, and many of the cities and towns, or most towns in Massachusetts, have an open town meeting process where people go in, debate an issue, discuss it, and bring it before the floor and vote it up or down,
Yeah, but
and
Gene,
vote their budget.
let's go back to what we were talking about before, death penalty question, which you're upset is not, at least as of the moment, not going to be in the 96 ballot. The Senate and House debated it. It wasn't successful, at least in the House, one of the two chambers. That's democracy. Those 200 people were elected by the people back home. If people are unhappy and have such a passion, as you suggest, for the death penalty, then they should decide not to send those people back
Well,
to
it's a
Beacon
lot
Hill.
easier
Isn't
to say
the-
that than to do it, because we all know the process of electing people is a very tough process to do, or defeating people. In this last year in the Congress in the
Money,
United States,
another reason.
Well, money is.
I'm
there's
smiling
when-
because that's money. That's a money.
But that's
a
where money does
discussion.
come into play, and that's why you do have a referendum process as
No,
a
but it's more
safeguard.
complicated. Suppose I agree with Diane Wilkerson on the death penalty, but I disagree with her on 4 or 5 other issues. I'm not going to vote on just that one issue because her opponent might be someone I disagree with on.
Unless she supports tax increases, and then you'd vote against her on that one issue,
Not
wouldn't you?
necessarily. Not if I disagree with her on everything else. I mean, it's just.
Diane, how personally do your colleagues take these ballot questions? I think the conventional wisdom, and you tended to agree with it a couple of minutes ago, is that's why they are proliferating from the left, right, and the middle. How do your colleagues feel when there's been an issue they've been debating, successfully, unsuccessfully, to conclusion or not, when people go out, like some of these people, like me, and all of a sudden collect signatures and basically say it's because those horrible legislators don't know what they're doing?
Well, you know, interestingly enough, I think that the discussion around campaign finance reform, for example, and the threat of having it on the ballot,
For which people
referendum-
collected signatures.
That's right. Was in fact the motivation for why the legislature did it, and clearly the intention was to preempt it, and I think went a long way, certainly longer and farther than most people thought that the legislature was prepared to go. So I think that my feeling about that means that it does work and it does have an impact on people. But there's some that I think that they're not going to respond to. But I think that there's growing concern.
We only have 30 seconds
About
more.
the
Let's
proliferation.
go from the sort of the sublime to the ridiculous in terms of questions. There really will be a question, as I suggested to you earlier in the show, that says cats should be treated like dogs. There really will be a question that says that tattoos should become legalized in Massachusetts. Is this something that the Secretary of State should be spending $1,500 on to print petitions, that government should be occupied with, that secretaries of state then have to print ballots on?
Have you
Is this
taken
an
a
appropriate
look
topic?
lately at the bills that they're considering on Beacon Hill that are filed in stacks like this that are equally ridiculous, and yet they have to spend their time, and we're paying
Sorry,
them to spend their
tattooers,
time
she
deal
said
on
it,
it?
not me.
Hey,
So the answer is, defenders, at least 2 of you across the board, let it be.
Right.
But that's because our process is one that allows everyone and anyone who has an idea and bill to file it, and it's our responsibility to read through them. And so the reality is that even after we read through them and take out the ones that really are, and there are many that are ridiculous, you can still get it on the ballot anyway.
And
Having
you
said
cannot
that,
do that
we
with a
got-
ballot question. If they're too ridiculous, people won't sign them, and they'll never be on the ballot.
On that note, we got to go. Barbara Anderson,
tolls on the turnpike goes through.
forgot about it, by the way. Tolls on the turnpike. Remove the toll. Is there ever been a question that got 100% of the vote in Massachusetts? That may be the first one. Barbara Anderson from Citizens for Limited Taxation, Gene Hartigan, Republican consultant, State Senator Diane Wilkerson. And when we come back in 2 minutes on our Reporters Corner, we'll be joined by Wayne Woodley from the Boston Herald, Joan Vanacchi of the Boston Globe,